Okay, good morning. We are on Kufid Zayin with Aleph, 117a. If you look at the middle-sized lines, and you count three up, the first word is Rav, and go to the end of the line where it's at three up from the middle-sized lines, from the end of the middle-sized lines.
From the end.
Yeah, count three up, and you go to the end of the line, and the third to last word says Vaha Amar, or the fourth to last word says Aini.
Yeah.
Okay, so what did we say? We left off yesterday with this idea of Simcha, joy, as a condition, precondition for any engagement with the divine, basically. Started off with King David's presence of Hashem resting upon him only through song, either first the presence of Hashem, then song, or song and then presence of Hashem, and then quoting the verse which said about Elisha, who got angry and therefore lost the divine presence, and he brought someone to play music for him, and that brought him back to a state where he was able to receive a divine inspiration. So the Gemara said the same thing is true of learning halacha. The same thing is true of a good dream. Good morning.
Good morning.
The same thing is true of what was the other one? Halacha, good dream, and I guess divine presence, where joy is a prerequisite. So the Gemara now challenges that proposition here. The Gemara now challenges that proposition. Wait, Kufi Zayin Aleph.
There's a little gimel next to the.
No, but it's not here. Aini.
Is this about dreams and
No, we'll get there.
oh, okay.
Aini says, the Gemara, is this indeed the case? That joy is the prerequisite for Torah learning? But Rav Gidl said the name of Rav. Call Talmud Chacham, any scholar, Hayoshiv Lefnei Rabbi, who sits before his master, his teacher, and learning, the Ein Sifsois of Noitvois Mar, and his lips are not drooling in dread, in tremble, in fear and awe, because he's receiving Torah. So anyone who doesn't do that, tichvena, he should get burned, because he's not giving the proper honor and respect due to the fact that he's now imbibing of the divine word, just as the Jews were at the receiving of Torah the first time. Right, the Gemara says, "Elsa malhalan the aim of a yido v'desis v'zeya," just as it was the first time the Jews were in absolute awe, trembling, dread in the presence of God. So shall it be every time a person learns. Shenemar continues Rav as the verse reads. The verse reads in the Song of Songs. Sivsoisov sheshanim noitvois mar over. So I'm reading the verse in English from Chabad translation. It's chapter 5 of Song of Songs, verse 13. Her jaws are like the bed of spice, growth of aromatic plants. And here's the main text that we're quoting. Sivsoisov, his lips, Shoshanim are like roses, Noitvas mar over, dripping with flowing myrrh. That's the translation. So Shoshanim translates as roses, Noitvas dripping, mar over flowing myrrh. So the Gemara now offers a different translation and reading as follows. Back to the text of the Gemara. Al tikri Shoshanim. Don't read it as Shoshanim, which means roses. Ella Sheshonim. Change it to those that learn. Take the vav and put it from between the two shins, Shoshanim, and put it after the two shins, reading Sheshonim, those that learn. Okay, so those that learn, their lips are dripping with myrrh, or flowing with myrrh. So now, I'll tikra myrrh over. Don't read it as myrrh over, which is the word for myrrh. What are they called? Flowing myrrh. What was it? Flowing myrrh. Yeah. Read it elamar over. Take away the vavs and read it as like a bitter drool almost. Read it like that, indicating anyone who's learning should be dripping with dread.
Interesting, because I think myrrh, isn't that like the sap from a tree?
Yes, that's the
So
myrrh from the flower.
It flows at some point before it turns to crystal. I don't know.
Right. Well, it's referring to the rose here. The rose drips with like a sap, right? The rose. But here he's talking about the one who learns should be dripping in fear and dread. So this seems to contradict what we said yesterday, which is that it's supposed to be in joy. So is it joy or dread? Or fear, or awe?
Mhm.
Which one? So says the Gemara like Kasha. No question. How's that? Haberabba, habetalmida. One statement stating that you should be in joy is referring to the teacher, and the statement which says that a person should be in awe is the student. So this perspective is saying that when a person has the privilege of having already included Torah in his knowledge database and has now been granted the opportunity and the privilege to share that, should be in absolute full joy in that he's been granted the privilege and been chosen to be a conduit for divine wisdom. This is the greatest joy. But while this one is on the receiving end of that content, is in the receiving end of Torah, when a person is in a state of receiving, a person has to be in a state of openness. We've spoken about this before, quoting Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Rabbi Simon Jacobson, who was one of the scholars whose job it was to memorize the Rebbe's talks on Shabbos and Yom Tov and then relay them after Shabbos and Yom Tov, as there's no recordings. So he explains how he's able to memorize like that. And he explains you have two wheels in your head. You have a thinking wheel and you have a listening wheel. And he says when you're listening, you have to turn off your thinking wheel. Because if you interject your own thoughts, you're not listening anymore. You're now thinking about your own ideas. So you have to turn on the listening wheel to listen to what's being said without thinking about it, just to absorb it. Completely set yourself aside. And then once you absorbed it, now think about it. Because if you're busy, that's what happens all the time. As a teacher, I see this all the time. I'm teaching and someone makes an association in their head. And now they're thinking about the association and they're completely not listening to class anymore. Because they're thinking about the association that they've made and what they know, instead of actually learning anything new. So if you're constantly thinking about what you know, you're not learning anything new. So it's true when you're reading too. You could be reading and then all of a sudden while you're reading, something clicked in your head and you start thinking about something else and you're not listening to what the book's saying anymore. So as a receiver, you cannot be present. You have to be set aside. And therefore, on the receiving end, the person has to be in awe. I'm receiving, not joy, because joy is expressive. When I'm in joy, when I'm in a state of elation, what fills up my feelings is me. What fills up the space is me and my enjoyment. And if what fills up the space is me and my enjoyment, I'm not taking anything new because I've already filled up the whole space, my emotional, mental space. Therefore, as a teacher, happy, joyous, because you're supposed to be expressive. And joy is associated with expression. When a person in a state of happiness, he wants to share. When a person's not in a state of happiness, he closes down. But as a receiver, if I'm in a state of joy, I'm not listening because I filled up the whole space with my own feelings. And therefore, my feelings have to be received, and it's a state of awe and dread. So I'm open. Awe and dread, not like we're having anxiety, but awe and dread in the sense that I've set myself aside and I'm open to receiving what is, rather than interjecting my feelings into it. So this is one perspective in reconciling these two statements of Torah with joy as a giver of Torah, and Torah in awe and reverence and respect as a receiver. And of course, there are times when we're both. It's not as if this is uniquely one person will always be one. Sometimes a person is in the giving end, sometimes in the receiving end. Right? So the joy on the teacher's end is not just because when you're in a state of joy, you're better to give, but also if you're in a state of annoyance and tightness, then you lose patience with the students and you can't be a good teacher. You got to be in a state of happiness where you have patience for your students and you can listen and you can comment and guide them. Because if you're not feeling that openness and that flow of joy, then it's going to be very difficult to teach with empathy and with patience, which is required as a teacher. But as a student, one has to put their own feelings aside, not joy. It's fear, awe, to contain oneself, to put themselves on the side, and that way they can truly be recipients of the new Torah, especially if a teacher is a truly real master and teacher in which his learning far surpasses the student. That's the point of a good teacher and student, right? Like you're listening, right? If you're listening to someone who's way of a bigger master, you have to just Stop. You understand that your version of thinking is down here and his version is up here. If you want to get up here, you got to put this aside and allow yourself to be open to that higher learning, and then the person can truly learn. So teacher versus student, joy versus awe, respect. Yes.
The teacher, by the way, that what you just said about the teacher is found in Pirkei Avot, about being patient.
That's right. That's where I got it from. Okay. Continues the Gemara. Not Ibai Sema. Yes, that's right. But this teacher has to be patient. Captain Malamed. I think it comes along with being joyous. In a person in a state of joy, it's much easier to be patient. Okay, so that's one way of reconciling these two statements. Joy of learning versus the fear and awe. Here's another. Here's another perspective. Both the joy and the awe is talking of the teacher, not just the student. So how does that work? Says the Gemara, like kasha, no contradiction. Ha mekamed the pasach, ha labasa the pasach. The statement which says that the person is supposed to be joyous in learning, that is prior to learning. Put yourself in a good mood for all the reasons we just kept on saying. As a teacher, a person has to be open, has to be willing to give, and that all comes with joy. For patience and to be able to be in a good space where he's learning and he's sharing before he starts. But the statement which says that the person has to be in a state of awe, reverence, that's after he starts talking. Once he starts talking, and he realizes that and he's aware of the fact that he's a conduit for the divine truth, he too has to stay in a state of awe. Everything we said about the student before has to stay in a state of awe so that he's open to receive. This teacher also has to have the state of awe so that he's open to being a conduit. Because there's two things happening at once. On the one hand, the teacher has to be happy, open, so he shares and full of patience they can give. At the same time, as a teacher, if he's truly going to convey the message of Hashem, what cannot be felt is his feelings. What has to be felt is the divine message that comes through him. So he too has to set himself aside. So he begins with joy before he starts to put himself in the right, proper frame of mind, in a happy, joyous space where he's open to giving. And then once he starts talking, there's the awe and reverence, understanding that the words he's saying here are not his own, they're divine. The Gemara says, this is quoted in Tanya, Ki had Rabba, as was Rabba's practice, the great teacher Rabba. Rabba means the great one. Teacher of Rava, Abaye, and others. Mekamed the Pasach Lula Rabbanon, before Rabba would begin his sermon or his class with the students, Omar Milsa de B'dichusa, he would say a joke. He would say a joke before he would start, like a good lecture. He would give a joke at the beginning. Ubat Rabbanon, and then the sages would laugh, so the listeners, the students would laugh. And afterwards, Yosef Be'emisa, he would sit in awe, Upasach B'shmait, and begin his lecture. So he would start with a joke and then go to his lecture with awe. So this transition from joy to seriousness to reverence. What's interesting here is the Gemara adds, Ubat Rabbanon. The students laughed, sages that he was talking to laughed, which adds, the way the Gemara framed it here was, how do we reconcile the statement? They're both talking about the teacher, but this one is before he starts talking joy, while he's talking awe. But in the model of Rabbah, it's not just the teacher who was saying a joke at the beginning, but also the students who were laughing at the beginning, which means it's both teacher and student who start off with joy and then go transition into awe, right? Because a student has to also be in a good mood if he wants to listen.
We touched on this yesterday about frivolity.
What does that? It's not frivolity, it's joy.
Right, no, but I'm saying.
That's what I wanted to get to.
Joyful yesterday, but the line is once it becomes frivolous.
It's no longer, that's what does it?
You've crossed the line and then there.
What does this? This is what I want to go to in today's Tanya. I mentioned this yesterday. Yesterday in today's Tanya talks about this subject with respect to davening, actually, because a similar thing he said about davening. I'll explain in a moment. But first, let's finish up the Gemara here before I get to that comment. So again, we had a contradiction: joy versus awe in Torah learning. Two reconciliations. Reconciliation A: teacher joyous, student awe. Reconciliation B: it's both the teacher before teaching joy, joke, then teaching in reverence. But in the model of Rabbah, we have also the student going through this transition because he listens to the joke and laughs and then gets to awe as he learns. Okay, so a few things to say about this Gemara in terms of its relationship to Tanya. Number one, I mentioned that the Tanya quotes this Gemara. A few parts of this Gemara quoted in the Tanya, but specifically I'm referring to the part where it says that Rabbi would say a joke, the Alter Rebbe uses this as a model for what's called Klipas Noiga, chapter 6 of Tanya, or 7, but I think it's 6, where the Alter Rebbe explains that most of this world, which is not forbidden by Torah law, has the ability to be elevated. This table, we can sit around and plot how to rob a bank, or we can sit around and learn Torah, right? Because you can use it for positive or negative, for godly or for the ungodly. The Alter Rebbe says the same thing is true of experiences, like drinking wine. It could be in a frivolous state, or it could be to open the mind and heart to learning. Quoted the Gemara. Likewise, says the Alter Rebbe, even with a joke. The joke itself is not necessarily Torah, but because it's being used to put the students in a good frame of mind to learn Torah, it elevates the joke.
It's for the sake of heaven.
Correct, it's elevated in that way. So that's the first place it's quoted. Now, the other thing I want to say, which is connected to yesterday's Tanya and today's Tanya, where the Gemara has a similar statement with respect to prayer. In the Gemara in Brachot, it says, one should not begin to pray unless he's in a state of heavy-headedness, meaning seriousness, concentration. Conversely, the Gemara also says, a person should only daven from joy. So which one is it? It's actually there, funnily enough. Where's the Tanya?
It doesn't seem like they have to be
Mutually exclusive.
yeah.
I'll explain that in a second. Yes, I'll explain that in a second. So actually there, in Tanya, when it comes to prayer, it's actually the reverse. Namely, it's in the Igeret HaTshuva, chapter 11, I believe it is. Well, actually, first it's chapter 10, then 11. Yesterday 10, today 11. So there it's actually the reverse, where before prayer, there's a sense of seriousness because the person has to let go of his sin. He has to let go of the past. That's the lower level of Teshuvah as explained in Tanya. Let's go of what was, and that requires a very seriousness and understanding that what I did was a serious problem and I have to let go of that. And then from there, the person transitions into the great joy of, wow, I'm so lucky and privileged I get to be one with Hashem. Transition from there to there. Here it's the reverse. When it comes to Torah, it's the other way around. It starts off with joy. So that way I put myself into a good frame of mind to receive, or as a teacher to give. And then the seriousness of understanding that I'm in the presence of Hashem. That I'm a conduit for Hashem's word or receiving Hashem's word. As a student or as a teacher. Now, what's interesting to your point is that when it comes to the davening model, the Alter Rebbe explains that the joy and the R, not, first of all, he talks about how it's not necessarily so easy to go transition between the two feelings, and how it used to be that a person can transition very quickly. Nowadays, it takes more time. Maybe a person should start a few hours earlier, because it's very difficult for us to transition from one feeling to another so drastically. So he talks about that a bit. Like Thursday night, feeling the dread of trying to let go of the week. Shabbos, the joy of being one with Hashem. So it gives us more time to transition from one feeling to the other. But moreover, he says, the joy and the seriousness come from two different places, and therefore can coexist. As explained in chapter 34 of Tanya, Greater Length, part 1, 34 of book 1, where there it explains that because the dread and the fear, the seriousness, talking about prayer here, the seriousness comes from the fact that my animalistic self engaged in its animalistic behavior. And my joy comes from my godly soul's ability to reconnect to Hashem. So because they come from two different places, they're not in contradiction. I can simultaneously feel the seriousness of disconnect for Hashem and the joy of reconnection to Hashem simultaneously, because they're not in contradiction to each other. They come from two different places within. Perhaps, over here it's a little bit more difficult, but perhaps a similar thing. The joy, maybe here's a little bit different. The joy that comes before the learning, the joke, that's actually speaking to my animal soul. It's talking to my animal soul, right? Using the model we just said before of the Alter Rebbe in chapter 6 of Tanya, where there he said the joke is like that level of klipa that can be elevated or degraded. And in this case, it's being elevated because it's being used for Torah learning, which means we're talking about not a holy joke, but a human joke, because we're elevating it. If it was a holy joke, it would be elevated to begin with, right? So we're talking about the animal soul, who can either go up or down, right? And is now being elevated to go upward. So the joy is to bring my animal soul along. So my animal soul shouldn't protest the learning. You put it into, you give it a joke, so to speak, where it's like happy and therefore non-disruptive. The awe comes from the godly soul. The godly soul appreciating this, the fact that I'm receiving Hashem's Torah or transmitting Hashem's Torah. Transmitting itself being a kind of receiving too, as a conduit. So that awe comes from the godly soul.
So you're speaking to both souls.
I'm speaking to both souls. So first, Chassidim say a similar thing about l'chaim by Fabrengen. In order for the animal soul not to protest the Torah words, sometimes Torah words that require, scouring some of the negativity inward, you got to give the animal soul a little l'chaim so it feels a little less, so it protests the Fabrengen a little less. Chassidim would quote the halacha, which says that they would give the animal to they would give the animal to drink before they did the slaughtering, so that way the hide would come off easier.
They gave it water to drink.
Yeah, before the slaughtering, so that after it was already slaughtered, it'd be easier to take the hide, peel off the hide. So the same thing about the animal soul. If you got to peel off the animal soul's skin, sometimes you got to give it a little to drink, which is the idea of the joke here. You got to put it in a good mood so it doesn't protest the learning. If the learning is all heavy-handed, the animal soul is like, well, I'm not interested in all this. Leave me alone, go away. See if the godly soul is trying to focus, there's the animal soul nagging and saying, this is boring, this is annoying. But when the animal soul hears a joke, and you put the human self into a good mood, now the human self is no longer protesting the godly soul's journey. And then the godly soul can stand in a state of elation and fear and awe and reverence as it receives the divine wisdom. Yeah, what do you want to say?
Isn't it interesting that many of the great speakers that I've listened to in the last number of years, they start with the jokes.
This is where it comes from.
They follow it up.
This is where it comes from, to start with a good joke. I'm not so good at that. Even when I speak at I don't always start with a joke. But some people are good with it. Anyway, okay. So this is a very interesting little discussion here on the interplay of joy and seriousness. Mm-hmm. And it's all comes to what we were saying actually yesterday, that because we're not talking about frivolity, we're talking about true inner joy. It's not a contradiction to seriousness, which is why you can have this transition so quickly and why they can go together. The joy of coming to learn is not a contradiction to the seriousness of the learning. Frivolity is opposite to seriousness of learning, because frivolity is about an escape, but joy is not about an escape. Joy is about openness, right? So the human self, which is self-motivated, has to be brought in with a joy and an openness, and then the seriousness can flow almost as a natural consequence of that, without a contradiction whatsoever. Okay, God willing, tomorrow we'll continue our discussion, and we're going to get into more about the Hallel and the nature of Hallelujahs, and in relationship to the Seder night, which is really where we are. A wonderful day, Yidden.
Thank you.
Isn't it interesting, again, for